10 factories, 50,000 American jobs, and one senator who refused to stay silent. This is the story of J.D. Vance, the man who stood up when others looked away. In a moment broadcast across the nation, he faced down a billionaire CEO who had sold out American workers. With just one question, J.D. didn't just demand an answer, he demanded a reckoning. The room fell silent. The cameras kept rolling, and the country watched, breath held, as truth stared down power. What would you have said in that room? What would you have done with your family's future on the line? As we step into this story, know that what follows is a dramatization, a reflection of real struggles, real fears, and the unshakable spirit of those who fight for what's right. Names and moments may be imagined, but the heart of it all, the courage, the betrayal, the hope, is drawn from truths felt by countless American families. Let's walk into that room together and feel what they felt. Stay with us. Together, we'll walk into a moment that America will never forget. It began like any other ordinary evening in the town of Sheffield, Ohio. The kind of night where the biggest concern was whether the local team had won their game, or if the old neon sign above Joe's Diner would finally flicker out for good. But that night, the familiar rhythm of life shattered in an instant, with a single broadcast that changed everything. At precisely 6 o'clock, televisions blinked on across town. Some in bars where regulars nursed their beers after long shifts. Others in small homes where families gathered, plates still warm on the kitchen table. The screen filled with the image of TitanWorks CEO. Crisp suit, silver hair, a backdrop of the company's glass headquarters gleaming like a fortress. His voice was smooth, measured, practiced, but no amount of polish could soften the blow of what he was about to say. Today, to ensure TitanWorks' long-term success in an increasingly global market, we are announcing necessary operational changes. This includes the difficult decision to close 10 of our U.S. manufacturing facilities. These closures will enable us to better align with future growth opportunities abroad. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unreal, but he wasn't finished. In addition, we are pleased to announce new partnerships that will bring essential immigrant labor to support and strengthen our remaining U.S. operations. These workers are critical to maintaining our competitiveness and innovation. The room at Joe's Diner fell silent. A fork clattered to the floor. Lorna, the waitress who had 2 brothers working at TitanWorks, stood frozen, her notepad forgotten in her hand. A man at the bar slowly set down his glass, his knuckles white from the grip. Outside, in modest homes lined with worn American flags, parents exchanged looks they hadn't shared since the last factory closed. Looks filled with fear, disbelief, and something darker: betrayal. In one living room, a father, Mike, stared at the screen, the words echoing in his mind long after the broadcast ended. His teenage son sat beside him, quiet, wide-eyed. Mike swallowed hard, voice barely above a whisper. So now we lose jobs overseas and wages here too? Across Sheffield, the reaction was the same, a stunned, breathless quiet, broken only by murmured questions that had no answers. What about our mortgages, our kids, the promises they made? Some reached for their phones, desperate for clarification, hoping for some mistake, some misunderstanding. But the headlines confirmed it, cold and final. 10 plants to close, thousands of jobs gone, new foreign labor programs incoming, immediate implementation. Social media buzzed with confusion, anger, grief. Hashtags began to spread. Hashtag Titan betrayal. Hashtag sold out for profit. Hashtag who stands for us. People shared photos of the plants, of family members in hard hats, of union picnics from better days. Memories now clouded by loss. And yet beneath the shock, a gnawing suspicion took root. Had this been the plan all along? Had the town's loyalty, its decades of work, been nothing more than a stepping stone to higher profits, to a future that no longer included them? In the corner of Joe's Diner, old Frank, who'd worked 40 years at the plant before retiring, muttered to no one in particular, but loud enough to be heard, "There's one man who might call them out. Let's see if Vance has the guts." And so, As darkness settled over Sheffield, a town waited for answers, for a voice, for a fight they hoped wouldn't come too late. Stay with us. This is just the beginning. The night air in Washington was thick with a strange, uneasy stillness. Even the usual hum of the city, the distant wail of sirens, the low rumble of late traffic, seemed to fade as the Capitol's dome stood in silent witness to what was unfolding across the nation. In a modest office lit only by the flicker of a television screen, J.D. Vance sat alone, his sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, watching the TitanWorks announcement on replay. He had already heard every word. He didn't need to hear them again. But still he watched. Not out of shock, not even out of anger, though both simmered beneath the surface. He watched because in that moment, he felt the weight of those words not as a senator, but as a grandson. The face on the screen, polished, practiced, cold, was everything his grandfather had never been. JD's mind drifted, not because he wanted it to, but because the memory came uninvited, sharp and clear. He saw his grandfather's hands, scarred, strong, stained with the honest grime of decades spent at a steel mill not far from where TitanWorks was now shuttering its factories. J.D. remembered the pride in those hands, the quiet dignity in them. He remembered how those hands had held him as a boy, had built a life that wasn't rich in dollars but was rich in meaning. And now men in suits, men who had never felt the heat of a furnace or the sting of steel dust in their lungs, were erasing that kind of life with press releases and polished speeches. J.D.'s gaze hardened. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes never leaving the screen. Necessary adjustments, the CEO had said. Global competitiveness. J.D. mouthed the words, not in agreement, but with a bitter taste. How easily they dressed up betrayal in the language of progress. But it wasn't just about jobs going overseas. That would have been betrayal enough. J.D. knew what wasn't being said, the quiet part that stayed off camera but screamed between the lines. TitanWorks wasn't content just to ship work abroad. They intended to undercut what jobs remained by flooding the workforce with cheap temporary immigrant labor. J.D. believed in legal immigration. His family's story, like so many, was shaped by it. But this wasn't immigration in the spirit of building America. This was exploitation, plain and simple. A way to push wages down, pit neighbor against neighbor, and tell the ones left behind that they should feel lucky for what scraps remained. Outside his window, the city's monuments gleamed under the moonlight, as if mocking the promise etched into their stones. Of the people, by the people, for the people. J.D. wondered how many in those marble halls still remembered what those words meant when it came time to choose between a campaign check and a community survival. He ran a hand over his face, fatigue mingling with frustration. But beneath that, something steadier stirred. The same thing that had always stirred in him when he thought of where he came from. Resolve. The television played on, the CEO's speech looping into commentary, talking heads already spinning the narrative. J.D. didn't listen. His mind was elsewhere, in the rusting towns, in the silent factories, in the hollowed-out hearts of families who had given everything and been given nothing in return. The night was deep now, but J.D. knew there would be no sleep. Somewhere in that darkness, he had made up his mind. The fight wasn't coming. The fight was here. And as the first light of dawn began to brush the horizon, J.D. rose, his reflection in the window framed by the Capitol behind him. Not this time, he said quietly, the promise hanging in the air, as steady and unyielding as the man who made it. The promise J.D. whispered into the quiet dawn wasn't just for himself. As sunlight crept across the city, casting long shadows over marble and glass, it became clear that words weren't enough. Not now, not anymore. The fight had to begin, and it had to begin that day. Without changing his shirt, without pouring so much as a cup of coffee, J.D. called his chief of staff. His voice was steady, but beneath it ran a current of urgency that brooked no delay. I want everyone in the office. No excuses, 10 minutes. The staff gathered in the small conference room just off J.D.'s office, bleary-eyed, jackets wrinkled, ties loosened. Some clutched phones, still scanning headlines that grew grimmer by the hour. The CEO's statement was everywhere. Glowing press releases, carefully worded interviews, and glossy ads about TitanWorks' global future. But JD saw what his team saw: betrayal, dressed up and sold back to the public as progress. JD didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, hands on its edge, leaning forward as if the weight of what he had to say needed no distance between him and his people. His eyes swept the room. They were good people, smart, loyal, but JD knew what they were thinking. The same thoughts every staffer in this town thinks when power is challenged. Is this worth the risk? He answered the unspoken question before anyone could voice it. They're playing both ends against us, he began, his voice low but firm, each word measured. They're sending jobs away to countries where workers are paid pennies. And for the jobs they can't ship out fast enough, they're undercutting what's left, flooding the system with cheap labor through loopholes they paid lobbyists to write. The room was silent. A junior aide swallowed hard, as if realizing for the first time the scale of the fight they were about to enter. JD didn't waver. He straightened, drawing in a slow breath, letting the moment settle over them all. I know what this means, he said. They'll come at us. The money, the media, the consultants, all of it. But this isn't about a headline or a poll. This is about families who've done everything right and are getting crushed anyway. If we don't stand up now, we never will. A senior advisor cleared his throat cautiously. Senator, do you want to issue a statement? An op-ed? Maybe a round of interviews? JD shook his head, the determination in his eyes sharpening. No, we're past statements. I want hearings, public hearings. I want that CEO in a chair, under oath. I want their charts, their memos, their numbers on record. And I want every senator in that room to have to look their voters in the eye when this is done. Another aide hesitated. Just offshoring, sir? Or the labor loopholes too? JD didn't miss a beat. Both. No more half-truths. No more hiding behind talking points. The American people deserve the whole picture, and they're going to get it. The weight of his words filled the room, but instead of fear, something else sparked in the eyes around him. Resolve. Phones began to buzz as staffers started making calls, drafting memos, setting things in motion. Outside the window, the city stirred fully awake, but inside that room, a different kind of awakening had taken place. And as JD watched his team move with purpose, he felt the burden on his shoulders shift. Not because it was lighter, but because he knew he didn't carry it alone. The fight had begun, and this time, no one would be able to say they didn't see it coming. The gears of TitanWorks defense began turning long before the sun had fully risen over Washington. While JD's team worked through the early hours to set hearings in motion in a sleek boardroom atop the company's glass and steel headquarters, the CEO and his inner circle gathered to plot their next move. They knew the storm was coming. JD's call for hearings had already leaked, setting off a media buzz that couldn't be contained. But TitanWorks wasn't built by men who waited for storms to pass. They were built by men who learned how to redirect the wind. The CEO, the same man whose smooth delivery had announced the closures the night before, sat at the head of the long table, his demeanor calm but eyes sharp. Around him sat his top executives, public relations specialists, and high-priced consultants flown in overnight. The stakes were clear. Millions of dollars in contracts, investor confidence, the company's carefully polished image. We don't fight this with fact, the CEO said, steepling his fingers. We fight this with story. Our story. We get ahead of their narrative. He clicked a remote, bringing up the first of many slides on a giant screen. Images of smiling workers from diverse backgrounds, flags of multiple nations waving behind them, captions that read, "Building a global family and innovation without borders." This isn't about cost cutting. This is about inclusion, about preparing for the future, he continued. We highlight our immigrant hiring as a strength. We show that we're creating opportunities, not taking them away. And we emphasize our global partnerships as the only way to stay competitive. If they want to paint us as villains, we make sure America sees us as visionaries. There were nods around the table, but also unspoken tension. They all knew, though none said it aloud, that this wasn't about vision, it was about margins, about shaving every possible dollar, squeezing every bit of profit by paying less, here or overseas. The CEO didn't need to say it because they were all there to make it happen. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that even as their plan took shape, JD's team was uncovering the truth behind the glossy slides and rehearsed lines. In a cramped back office in the Capitol, two junior aides huddled over a stack of leaked internal memos and financial statements sent anonymously just that morning. They weren't flashy, no grand smoking gun, but the pieces fit together too perfectly to ignore. Charts showing labor cost savings projections tied directly to offshoring. Draft press releases that mentioned diverse hiring long before any plans were made to actually implement it. And perhaps most damning, a memo from the head of operations. We can achieve significant savings by maximizing visa programs for temp labor while public focus remains on factory closures. One aide rubbed his eyes, disbelieving. They planned this, he said quietly. All of it. The other nodded, already drafting a summary for JD. They want to wrap greed in a flag and call it progress. Outside, the city moved through another day, unaware of the battle lines being drawn in boardrooms and back offices. But inside those walls, both sides prepared for what was coming. The CEO believed his story would shield him. JD knew the truth could pierce through anything, if he could bring it into the light in time. And so the stage was set. A tale of two strategies, one of deception, one of resolve, both racing toward the moment when the nation would finally have to choose which it believed. If the CEO's boardroom had been all polished glass and rehearsed lines, the world JD stepped into that afternoon was the opposite, raw, real, and bruised by betrayal. The air around the shuttered Titan Works facility on the edge of town still smelled faintly of oil and metal, though the machines had long since gone quiet. JD had been here before, not as a senator, but as a boy, holding his grandfather's hand during a union picnic. Back then, this place had felt indestructible, a fortress of industry that would always be part of the town's heartbeat. Now it stood hollow, a silent monument to promises broken. JD walked past the rusting fence, greeted by a small cluster of former workers who had gathered at word of his visit. No cameras, no reporters, just men and women whose faces bore the lines of hard work and hard times. He shook their hands one by one, listening more than speaking as they poured out stories of paychecks that shrank while their hours stretched, of training temp workers brought in under special visa programs, only to see those same workers take the shifts that once supported their families. A man named Dale, 30 years on the line, spoke with quiet bitterness. It wasn't just the jobs they sent overseas, Senator. It's what they did to the ones that stayed. They brought in temps, told us we should be glad to have work at all, then cut our wages and doubled our quotas, and we kept our mouths shut because we had to feed our kids. A woman beside him, Maria, nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. They called it innovation, said we needed to compete, but what they meant was we needed to work for less, a lot less. JD took it all in, his jaw tight, fists curling at his sides, not in anger at them, but at what had been done to them. He had seen the memos. Now he saw the human cost. The numbers weren't just figures on a page. They were Dale's mortgage, Maria's son's college fund, the retirement dreams sacrificed at the altar of shareholder value. As they spoke, JD's gaze drifted toward the building's side entrance, where a cracked door hung ajar. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside, the group following. The lunchroom greeted them like a ghost. Tables and chairs were scattered, some overturned as if abandoned in haste. Dust coated everything, but on one wall, tattered and sun-faded, a poster still clung stubbornly. Made in USA. Built with pride. The words, once bold, now seemed like a cruel joke in the dim light. JD stared at it, the silence heavy except for the soft sound of boots scuffing on the grimy floor. My grandfather used to say that sign meant something, JD said quietly. Meant you could hold your head up, feed your family, stand tall. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The truth was in that room, in every speck of dust, in every broken promise reflected in JD's eyes. And as he stepped back into the fading afternoon light, JD felt the weight of those stories settle onto his shoulders. The polished words of the CEO's defense, the glossy ads, the crafted narrative, none of it could erase what he'd seen, what he'd heard. This wasn't just about a company or a town anymore. This was about the soul of a nation. The fight ahead would be brutal, but after that visit, JD knew one thing with absolute certainty. It was a fight worth every ounce of strength he had left. When JD stepped out of the factory's shadow and back onto the cracked pavement, the weight of the place followed him. The faces of the workers, the hollow quiet of the lunchroom, the faded promise on that poster. It all burned itself into his mind, sharper than any memo, stronger than any stat. By the time he reached his car, his decision was made. There would be no more backroom meetings, no more careful statements drafted for the evening news. The country deserved to see the truth, raw and unvarnished, and JD would make sure it happened. That night, with the Capitol lit like a city of marble ghosts behind him, JD stood before a small crowd of reporters in the Senate press gallery. No grand staging, no teleprompters, just a microphone and a man who had nothing left to lose. The cameras flicked on, pens clicked, and the room held its breath as he spoke. His voice was steady, measured, but beneath it burned a fury sharpened by what he'd seen. I've listened to the stories, I've seen the numbers, and I've walked through the ruins left behind when corporations choose greed over loyalty. What TitanWorks is doing isn't just offshoring, it's wage suppression, plain and simple. And they're using loopholes in our immigration system to do it. JD's eyes swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. That ends now. I'm calling for public hearings. We'll expose both, the offshoring that's hollowing out our towns and the manipulation of immigration meant to drive down wages for the workers who still have jobs. Questions came fast, as he knew they would. Senator, isn't this a bit ambitious? You're taking on big business and immigration policy at the same time. Are you positioning yourself as a populist here? One reporter asked, her pen poised above her notepad. JD didn't flinch. Call it what you want. I'm not interested in labels. I'm interested in results. The people who sent me here didn't ask for speeches. They asked for someone who'd fight for them when it counted. Another reporter chimed in, more skeptical. Critics will say you're stirring division, that you're turning economic issues into culture war. JD met his gaze without hesitation. What I'm doing is shining a light. If that makes people uncomfortable, they should ask themselves why. The room buzzed with murmurs, phones lighting up as the headlines practically wrote themselves. VANCE demands CEO testify. VANCE targets offshoring and cheap labor schemes. Populist or protector? Within minutes, cable news panels were debating whether JD's move was political theater or the first real stand anyone had made in years. But for JD, the chatter didn't matter. What mattered was that the fight had finally stepped out of the shadows. As the reporters filed out, JD lingered at the window, watching the city below. Lights flickered in office towers where deals were still being made, strategies plotted, statements drafted to blunt what he'd set in motion. Let them try, because now the nation would be watching. The hearings weren't just coming, they were inevitable, and JD intended to make them count. The morning after JD's announcement, America woke not just to headlines, but to an all-out media barrage. TitanWorks moved swiftly, their response as polished and calculated as the decisions that had gutted factories and hollowed out towns. From television screens in airports to social media feeds on millions of phones, a single message beamed out in vibrant colors and stirring music. TitanWorks wasn't the villain. TitanWorks was the future. The ads were slick. Footage of workers in bright safety vests and hard hats, many with immigrant stories carefully framed for maximum impact. A woman from El Salvador operating a robotic arm. A man from Vietnam supervising an assembly line. A young technician from Kenya programming a machine. Each face was paired with a tagline, "Heroes of Industry, Builders of Tomorrow." The narrator's voice, warm and confident, spoke of diversity, resilience, and progress. TitanWorks is proud to stand with workers from every corner of the globe. Together, we're building an America ready for the challenges of the 21st century on social media. Hashtags trended, hashtag heroes of industry, hashtag stronger together, hashtag innovation, inclusion. The company's pages overflowed with carefully curated testimonials, short clips of workers, real or scripted, no one could quite tell, praising Titan Works for giving them a chance to pursue the American dream. The message was clear. Titan Works wasn't just a company, it was a moral force. And J.D. Vance? He was the man trying to tear that down. Pundits picked up the narrative with gusto. Cable news panels filled with analysts and commentators debated whether J.D. had crossed a line. Is this a crusade against offshoring or a veiled attack on immigration itself? One anchor mused, eyebrow arched for the camera. Another chimed in, it's a dangerous game. We all know how quickly economic concerns can slip into nativist rhetoric. J.D. watched the coverage from his office, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He saw how quickly his effort to protect workers was being twisted into something ugly, something it was never meant to be. His phone buzzed with texts, some from allies offering quiet support, others warning him to tread carefully. The smear was working. The narrative was shifting, but J.D. refused to let it stand. That afternoon at a town hall already scheduled in a community center in Dayton, J.D. faced the music head-on. Cameras rolled as he took the stage before a crowd of union workers, small business owners, and retirees. The very people who would bear the brunt of Titan Works' schemes. His voice was firm, his message clear. Let me say this plainly so no one can twist my words, J.D. began, his eyes sweeping the room. Legal immigrants deserve fairness. Many of them have worked hard, sacrificed, and strengthened this country. But no system, no loophole, no backroom deal should ever be used to crush the American worker. That's what this fight is about, and that's the fight I intend to win. There was a pause, the kind that comes when people weigh what's being said against what they've been told. And then the room erupted in applause, not loud or raucous, but steady, sincere. J.D. let it wash over him, not because he needed their approval, but because he needed them to know he stood with them, no matter how loud Titan Works ads or pundits' voices became. Outside, the media machine roared on. But inside that hall, something more powerful took root. Clarity, the kind that no ad campaign could erase. The applause from the Dayton Town Hall still echoed in J.D.'s memory as he returned to Washington, but it was quickly drowned out by the storm waiting for him in the Capitol. Titan Works' media machine hadn't let up for a second. If anything, it had grown louder, more aggressive, more personal. And now the backlash wasn't just coming through television screens or online debates. It was coming for J.D. directly, in ways designed to hurt where it counted most. The first blow came quietly, in the form of phone calls not returned, and emails met with polite but firm refusals. Donors who had long written checks at his fundraisers, business leaders who once smiled at photo ops, they began to disappear. One by one, names that had lined up behind J.D. when he spoke of opportunity and resilience began to fade into silence. Campaign treasurer reports showed the numbers. Contributions that had once flowed steadily began to dry up, replaced by nothing but cautious messages about reassessing priorities or waiting for the dust to settle. J.D. understood what they really meant. Titan Works and its allies had made their displeasure known, but it didn't stop there. Across the country, corporate-funded groups sprang up almost overnight. Groups with friendly names like Americans for Unity and Progress for All, and they came armed with a single mission: to paint J.D. Vance as the face of division. Billboards appeared along highways showing J.D.'s photo alongside inflammatory slogans, accusing him of turning neighbor against neighbor. TV ads showed carefully spliced clips of his speeches, stripped of context, made to sound like attacks on immigrants rather than defense of workers. The subtext was clear. J.D. wasn't a protector, he was a problem. Protests followed. Organized rallies outside his district offices, outside town halls, even on the steps of the Capitol itself. Paid organizers handed out signs with messages J.D.'s team knew hadn't come from the communities they claimed to represent. Hate has no home here. Stop the scapegoating. The media ate it up, framing the coverage as a grassroots response, never digging deep enough to see the money behind the outrage. Inside his office, staffers looked to J.D., some with worry, others with quiet admiration at his refusal to flinch. He could see the strain in their faces, the fatigue of fighting not just a company, but a narrative being written faster than they could answer it. And yet he stood firm. At a press briefing, with cameras trained on him, JD spoke not with the fire of a man under attack, but with the clarity of a man who knew why he was standing where he stood. This isn't about bigotry, it's about wages, about fairness, about the dignity of work. His voice was steady, unwavering. It's about whether we're going to let boardrooms decide what an American life is worth. I won't apologize for standing with the people who build this country. Outside, the protests continued. The attacks would keep coming. JD knew that. But what mattered wasn't the noise. It was the truth behind the stand he'd chosen to take, and the knowledge that the fight was far from over. The protests outside JD's office windows became part of the background noise. As persistent as the hum of traffic, as hollow as the slogans printed on signs paid for by corporate dollars. Inside, however, the atmosphere shifted. The storm Titanworks had unleashed wasn't going to be answered by speeches alone. JD's team understood this as clearly as he did. Words could inspire, but only facts could expose. And so they set to work, transforming frustration into focus, outrage into action. The conference room that once hosted strategy meetings became a war room of sorts. Tables overflowed with files, printouts, and data pulled from public records, anonymous tips, and leaked internal documents. The walls, once bare, now bore hastily taped charts and diagrams, mapping the tangled web Titanworks had tried so hard to keep hidden. Late into the night, staffers pored over spreadsheets and memos, fueled by black coffee and a shared sense of purpose that no media smear could shake. What emerged from the piles of paper and glowing screens was damning in its precision. JD's team traced the timeline of factory closures alongside executive compensation reports, revealing a brutal contrast. While thousands of jobs had been shipped overseas or erased entirely, the CEO and his top brass had quietly awarded themselves bonuses that would have covered hundreds of American paychecks. The numbers spoke louder than any speech could. Profits surged not despite the closures, but because of them. But the team didn't stop there. They dug deeper, following the paper trail from boardroom decisions to immigration filings. They uncovered how Titanworks had lobbied, behind closed doors, for specific tweaks in visa regulations. Tweaks that allowed them to flood low-wage sectors with temporary labor under the guise of essential skills. Visas meant to fill genuine gaps were instead being used to undercut existing workers, to create a race to the bottom in industries that had once offered a path to the middle class. JD's aides highlighted patterns where wage floors dropped immediately after these influxes, with local workers forced to choose between accepting less or losing their jobs altogether. At one point, a junior staffer looked up from a document, disbelief written across his face. "They engineered the whole thing," he said quietly, "from the closures to the pay cuts, to the smokescreen about innovation, all of it, just to squeeze more profit." JD, standing at the head of the table, said nothing for a moment. He let the weight of that realization settle over the room. Then, with a calm that came from certainty rather than fatigue, he spoke. "Good. Now we have what we need. Now we show the country the truth." As dawn approached, the Capitol outside stood still, unaware of the evidence mounting within those modest offices. But inside, JD's team felt the shift. They were no longer merely reacting to Titanworks' moves. They were preparing to strike back, not with anger, but with facts too clear to deny, too powerful to spin. The hearings would come, and when they did, JD intended to make sure Titanworks faced not just questions, but accountability. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and heavy, as if even the sky understood the weight of what was about to unfold beneath the great dome of the Capitol. The air buzzed with anticipation. Reporters clustered on the marble steps, cameras trained on the grand entrance, waiting for the faces who would define the day's story. Inside, the hearing chamber filled steadily. Lawmakers, staffers, lobbyists, and ordinary citizens who had managed to claim one of the coveted seats in the gallery. Everyone knew this wasn't just another hearing. This was the moment when Titanworks would have to answer, under oath, for the choices that had rippled through communities across America. J.D. Vance entered without fanfare. No entourage, no whispered strategizing, Just a man who had spent the sleepless night before going over every detail, every chart, every word he intended to say. He carried with him a thick binder, edges worn from study, and beneath his arm, a rolled set of charts that would soon cast the day's debate in stark relief. He glanced around the chamber, taking in the faces, some supportive, others skeptical, a few openly hostile, and then took his seat, calm and resolute. The gavel fell. The hearing was in session. J.D. rose slowly, deliberate in his movements, letting the hush settle across the room. When he spoke, his voice carried, not loud but clear, steady, meant for those in the gallery as much as those at the dais. Before us today is not just a question of policy or profit, J.D. began, unrolling the first of his charts and placing it on the easel beside him. The chart, stark and undeniable, showed a jagged decline. Wages in key manufacturing sectors plummeting over the past decade. It is the question of who we choose to stand for in this country. This, he pointed to the line slicing downward, is what happens when offshoring is rewarded and wage suppression is disguised as innovation. He gestured to a second chart, revealing job losses mapped against Titan Works factory closures and overseas expansions. Town names dotted the graph. Sheffield, Dayton, Rockford, names that drew murmurs from the gallery, names that were more than dots on a line to the families who had built their lives around those plants. This isn't abstract, J.D. continued, his gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of those who dared meet his in return. These are lives. These are futures. These are the people who made Titan Works what it was and who were discarded when profits demanded it. Behind him, aides brought forward copies of internal memos, the same ones his team had spent weeks piecing together. J.D. laid them on the table for the record, the paper heavy with the truth they carried. And let's be clear, J.D. said, voice firming, this isn't about legal immigration. This is about how loopholes were exploited. Loopholes that allowed Titan Works to flood sectors with temporary labor, driving down wages, driving out stability. We are here today not to debate slogans, but to face facts. The room was silent save for the scratch of pens, the click of cameras. Outside, the media machine was already spinning, but inside, for this moment, the facts stood unchallenged. J.D. glanced at the Titan Works CEO seated at the witness table, expression carefully composed but eyes betraying unease. The stage was set, the truth was on the table, and the nation was watching. The chamber seemed to shrink as the Titan Works CEO adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and leaned toward the microphone. His tone was calm, polished, the practiced voice of a man who had given testimony before, who knew the weight of words and the power of framing. Titan Works is proud to be a global company, he began, his gaze steady, trained not on J.D., but on the cameras. We are inclusive, we are efficient, and we are committed to maintaining our competitive edge in a rapidly evolving world economy. These decisions are never easy, but they are necessary for long-term survival, not just of our company, but of the communities we serve. He paused, letting his words hang in the air like a shield. The language was careful, the phrasing precise, designed to evoke progress, inevitability, even virtue. He spoke of innovation, of partnerships across borders, of embracing diversity as a strength. He pointed to the programs Titan Works had funded, the scholarships, the community grants, proof, he claimed, that the company's heart remained with the workers, even as its factories moved elsewhere. J.D. listened, silent, his face unreadable. But when the CEO finished, when the room seemed to hold its breath waiting for the next move, J.D. rose. His voice was quiet at first, but steady, cutting through the room's tension like a blade. You speak of inclusion, of efficiency, but let's talk about the human cost of that efficiency. He gestured to the charts beside him, the stark lines of wage decline, the mapped factory closures. I've walked through the towns left behind by your decisions. I've sat in the empty lunchrooms where your workers once gathered. I've looked into the eyes of men and women who gave decades of their lives to building your company, and who were discarded when the numbers on a spreadsheet told you it was time. J.D. turned to the gallery, to the faces leaning forward now, listening, waiting. Let's talk about what you called necessary. The memos where cost savings were tied not just to factory closures, but to exploiting visa programs. Temporary labor brought in not to fill gaps, but to drive wages down for the people who had built those jobs in the first place. He lifted a document, holding it up for the record. Your own operations head wrote, significant savings can be achieved by maximizing visa programs while public focus remains on closures. This wasn't inclusion. This wasn't innovation. This was manipulation of laws, of workers, of entire communities. The CEO shifted in his seat, his practiced composure cracking just slightly as the murmurs grew louder. JD let the silence work, let the weight of the facts speak for themselves. Then he continued, his tone firm, resolute. Legal immigration built this nation, but no system, none, should be twisted to crush the people who keep our towns alive, who raise families, who pay taxes, who believe in the promise of American work. Cameras clicked furiously. The air in the room felt charged, as if the truth, once spoken, had changed the shape of the debate itself. The CEO glanced down at his notes, but for once the words written there offered no safe path forward. The clash had been joined, not of slogans, but of realities laid bare. And as JD resumed his seat, the room seemed to know what came next would define more than just the hearing. It would define whose voice this country truly answered to. The chamber seemed to pulse with the tension left behind by JD's words. The CEO, once so polished, so confident in his crafted statements and careful talking points, now sat rigid, his eyes flicking between his counsel, his notes, and the cameras that captured his every hesitation. The facts were on the table, the manipulation exposed, but JD knew that facts alone didn't change hearts. Questions did. The kind of question that forced a man to see the face behind the number, the life behind the ledger. JD let the silence stretch, let the weight of what had just been said settle over every corner of the room. Then he leaned forward, his voice low but carrying to every ear, cutting through the stillness with the sharpness of truth. If your son, he began, his gaze locked on the CEO, lost his job abroad, lost it to a decision you signed off on, and then came home to find his wage here cut in half because of the choices you made, what would you tell him tonight? For a breathless moment, the room seemed suspended in time. The cameras zoomed in, the gallery leaned forward, the lawmakers froze, and even the CEO's own team sat motionless, waiting for the man they served to respond. But the answer didn't come. The CEO's mouth opened slightly, as if searching for words that might shield him, but none emerged. His practiced composure faltered. His eyes dropped from JD's, breaking the connection, seeking refuge in his notes, in the table, anywhere but the gaze of the man who had forced him to face what he had refused to see. The silence stretched on, a silence louder than any speech, heavier than any chart. And in that silence, the nation watching from living rooms, offices, and factory break rooms felt something shift. Social media lit up in real time. Clips of the moment began to circulate before the CEO could even find his voice. Hashtags racing across screens. Hashtag Vance question. Hashtag Truth in Congress. Hashtag Who Speaks For Us. JD didn't move to fill the gap. He didn't press, didn't gloat. He let the room, the nation, the CEO sit with the question, because that was the point. This wasn't about scoring points. This was about forcing the powerful to confront the human cost of their choices. Finally, the CEO cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, his voice thinner now, his response measured but hollow. Senator, I understand the concern. These are complex issues, and we strive to balance many factors in our decisions. But the moment had already passed him by. The room knew it. The gallery knew it. The country knew it. JD nodded once, as if to say, that's what I thought, then leaned back, letting the question, and the silence it had summoned, hang like a verdict over the proceedings. As the gavel eventually signaled a recess, reporters rushed to send out breaking updates, analysts prepared to dissect the moment from every angle, and ordinary people watching at home felt, for once, that the truth had pierced through the noise. JD left the dais quietly, his expression unchanged, but in his heart he knew. This was the line that would not be forgotten. This was the moment that showed who stood where and for whom. The echo of JD's question still lingered in the public's mind as news outlets replayed the clip on loop. For a brief moment, it felt as if truth had broken through the din of talking points and spin. But TitanWorks hadn't become a giant by letting moments like that stand unchallenged. Within hours of the hearing's recess, their counterattack began. Swift, ruthless, calculated. The first salvos came in the form of carefully crafted press releases. TitanWorks didn't mention the question that had left their CEO speechless. Instead, they reframed the entire hearing as an attack not on greed, but on progress. TitanWorks stands proudly with immigrant communities and global partners who are vital to our nation's future, the statement read. While we respect Senator Vance's concerns, we reject divisive rhetoric that seeks to pit workers against each other in an increasingly interconnected world. From there, the full weight of the company's PR machine came down like a hammer. Ads flooded the airwaves, filled with images of diverse workers smiling in TitanWorks hard hats, paired with stirring music and slogans like, "One workforce, one future." Op-eds appeared in national papers, penned by friendly voices who framed JD as out of step with modern America, a man clinging to an outdated vision of work and identity. On cable news, panels debated whether his stand in Congress was bold or dangerous, principled or reckless. More often than not, the verdicts leaned against him. JD watched the storm build from his office, not surprised but grimly aware of just how far his adversaries would go. His inbox filled with hate mail, messages accusing him of bigotry, of xenophobia, of trying to turn back the clock. Social media, once alight with praise for his question, now bristled with orchestrated outrage as hashtags like #VanceDivides and #OutOfTouch trended alongside genuine debate. Protests, too, followed. Outside his district offices, groups gathered with mass-produced signs and pre-printed slogans, chanting against what they called anti-immigrant fear-mongering. JD recognized the hallmarks of a corporate-funded operation: the slick coordination, the identical messages, the sudden flood of professionally produced materials. He knew it wasn't grassroots, but he also knew that perception often mattered more than reality, and TitanWorks had spent decades mastering that game. Yet amid the vitriol, something else stirred. Quiet messages came through back channels. Texts from union leaders, emails from small business owners, handwritten letters from workers who thanked him for saying what they felt no one else would say aloud. They didn't make headlines. They didn't trend online, but they were real, and they reminded JD why he had stepped into the fight in the first place. In a closed meeting with his staff, JD acknowledged the storm without flinching. "This was always going to happen," he said, voice steady. "But remember, this isn't about them. It's about the families who don't have PR firms, who don't have ad buys, who don't have lobbyists. They've got us, and I'm not backing down." Outside, the noise continued. The ads, the panels, the protests. But inside that room, and in communities that didn't make the news, support for JD's stand grew, quiet but firm. The battle lines had been drawn, and no amount of spin could erase the question that started it all. For days, the airwaves echoed with TitanWorks' polished spin, and JD's team braced for the worst. The possibility that the noise would drown out the truth. But something remarkable happened. Beneath the surface of the orchestrated outrage, in the places that rarely made national news, a different kind of movement took root. It didn't come with sleek advertisements or paid protesters. It came from union halls, break rooms, church basements, and small-town council chambers where the echoes of factory closures and wage cuts still rang painfully fresh. In the steel towns of Ohio, in textile communities in the Carolinas, in manufacturing hubs of the Midwest, workers gathered, some in organized meetings, others in impromptu gatherings, to share the clip that had ignited their hope. Over and over, they watched JD's question to the TitanWorks CEO, the moment when power was forced to face its own reflection. And each time, the meaning deepened. This wasn't just about one company or one hearing. It was about all of them. The jobs lost, the wages slashed, the dignity stolen piece by piece in the name of progress that never seemed to reach their doorsteps. Union leaders who had kept their distance in the heat of the media frenzy now stepped forward. Statements began to appear, firm, unapologetic. "Vance speaks for us," declared the president of a major manufacturing union. "This isn't about division. It's about fairness. It's about standing up for the people who keep this country running." Small-town mayors added their voices, issuing resolutions of support, writing op-eds in their local papers, speaking out at community meetings. In one televised address from a town devastated by factory closures, a mayor said simply, "Finally, someone in Washington sees us. And more than that, he's willing to fight for us." On social media, the tide shifted. The manufactured hashtags of the corporate campaigns faded, overtaken by organic voices using their own words, their own truth. Hashtag workers first. Hashtag fair labor, not cheap labor. Hashtag stand with Vance. Posts poured in. Photos of empty factories, pay stubs showing slashed wages, families gathered around kitchen tables trying to figure out what came next. And alongside them came words of solidarity, declarations that JD wasn't alone in the fight no matter how loud the opposition roared. Cable news, always quick to follow a new angle, began to shift as well. Analysts who once questioned JD's motives now framed the debate differently. Was Vance's stand the start of a new movement for American labor? Panel discussions turned to the substance of his claims, the data on wage suppression, the manipulation of visa programs, the brutal arithmetic of offshoring profits and local devastation. Inside JD's office, the mood changed. The weariness of fighting a smear campaign gave way to the quiet energy of knowing that the message had landed where it mattered most, with the people who had the most to lose and the most to gain. JD didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. But when his staff brought in reports of the growing support, of the voices rising in his defense, he allowed himself a small nod. Not of victory, but of resolve. "This is their fight as much as mine," he said almost to himself, "and we're just getting started." Outside, the noise of the city continued, but a new current ran beneath it. One not paid for, not choreographed, but real, rising, unstoppable. The nation wasn't just watching anymore, it was answering. The city had quieted by the time JD left his office. The bright chaos of the day, the headlines, the interviews, the statements of support, the angry voices of those determined to tear him down, had given way to the steady hum of night. Streetlights cast long shadows across the steps of the Capitol. The same building that earlier had felt like a battlefield, now standing solemn and still under the stars. JD walked slowly, hands deep in his pockets, the weight of the past weeks heavy on his shoulders. The victory, if it could be called that, wasn't without its price. Each footstep echoed softly against the marble, and as he moved past the grand columns, he thought of the faces that had filled the gallery during the hearing. The factory workers, the small-town mayors, the union reps who had come not out of duty, but out of hope. He thought of the letters on his desk, the ones written in shaky hands by retirees who had watched their pensions vanish, by young workers whose dreams had been deferred again and again. Their words replayed in his mind, louder than the praise, louder than the attacks. "Thank you for speaking for us. Don't stop." But even as those voices strengthened his resolve, JD felt the toll. The sleepless nights, the friendships frayed by politics, the allies who had quietly drifted away as the fight grew more bitter, more public, more dangerous to their own ambitions. And deeper than that was the knowledge that for all the momentum, for all the support rising across the country, the battle was far from over. Titan Works hadn't retreated. The ads still ran. The smear machine still hummed. And the next fight, the legislative one, would be even harder. He paused at the edge of the reflecting pool, looking back at the Capitol, its dome shining in the moonlight. He took a deep breath, the cool night air sharp in his lungs, grounding him. This wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about the promise of that building behind him, and whether it could still mean what it was supposed to mean. The soft sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention, and a familiar hand slipped into his. His wife joined him at the edge of the pool, her presence as steadying as the still water before them. For a long moment, they stood in silence, watching the lights dance across the surface. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but certain. You made them listen. You reminded them. JD turned to her, the tension in his face softening just slightly. I hope so, he said quietly, because the noise is going to get louder, and they'll try everything to make people forget. She squeezed his hand, anchoring him. Then you'll remind them again, and again. That's what you do. Together they stood beneath the night sky, the city stretching out before them. A city of power, of promise, of broken deals and hard-won truths. The toll was real. The fight was far from over. But in that moment, JD felt the strength to keep walking, to keep speaking, to keep fighting for those who couldn't. The quiet moments JD had stolen for himself that night beneath the Capitol dome were fleeting. By morning, the storm he had helped unleash was no longer just his to weather. What had begun as a lone voice challenging a giant had grown into a chorus that could no longer be ignored. Not by the media, not by the public, and now not even by his colleagues in Congress. The headlines spoke volumes. Vance's question still echoes. Workers rally behind Senator. Stock market reacts to Titan Works turmoil. Cable news devoted entire segments to the hearings. The question that froze the CEO. The growing grassroots movement that had emerged almost overnight. But the most remarkable shift was happening inside the marbled halls of power. Senators who had once kept their distance from JD's crusade began to feel the weight of public expectation pressing in on them. The phones in their offices rang off the hook. Constituents demanding answers, demanding action. Town hall meetings once sparsely attended were now filled to capacity, voices from communities long ignored, finally breaking through the static. One by one, lawmakers stepped forward, some driven by conviction, others by calculation, but all aware that the ground had shifted beneath them. Statements poured out, some carefully worded, others blunt. The time has come to re-examine offshoring incentives. We must ensure our immigration system serves workers, not just corporations. Titan Works must answer for its actions. Committees that had quietly shelved bills on corporate accountability and visa reform dusted them off. Proposals long dismissed as too politically risky found new life, fueled by a public that had found its voice and by lawmakers who now saw standing still as the greater risk. JD watched it all unfold with measured satisfaction, not because he believed the fight was won, but because he knew momentum, once built, was a force few could stand against. Meanwhile, the financial markets, ever sensitive to the winds of political change, reacted with the speed of fear. Titan Works, once the darling of Wall Street, saw its stock plummet as investors grew jittery. The company's carefully crafted image of stability cracked under the glare of scrutiny. Analysts who had once praised its global strategy now questioned its long-term viability in the face of mounting regulation and public backlash. Shareholders demanded answers. The board demanded a plan, and inside Titan Works' glass towers, the panic JD had predicted began to take hold. JD's staff tracked it all, the statements, the votes shifting, the markets trembling, and brought him updates in real time. But JD kept his focus where it had always been, on the people. He spoke at rallies, at union halls, and town meetings broadcast online to thousands. His message never wavered. This isn't about destroying a company. It's about rebuilding fairness. It's about reminding those in power who they serve. In those moments, as the tide turned in Congress and Titan Works reeled, JD understood something deeper. This wasn't just a political victory or a fleeting headline. This was a reawakening of workers, of communities, of a country too long told that its decline was inevitable. The battle ahead would be fierce. The forces arrayed against them would not give ground easily. But the first cracks had appeared, and from those cracks, change had begun to break through. The pressure that had built like a storm around Titan Works could no longer be deflected by slick ads or carefully worded statements. What began as murmurs of discontent had risen into a roar, from workers, from investors, from lawmakers who no longer found it politically safe to look the other way. Inside the boardrooms where strategies were once plotted with quiet confidence, panic now ruled. The numbers told the story. Stock prices tumbling, contracts in jeopardy, shareholder meetings turning hostile. The image Titan Works had so carefully crafted was cracking under the weight of public outrage and political will. It was in this atmosphere that the decision came, not with the bravado of the CEO's earlier announcements, but with the clipped tone of a man cornered. At a hastily arranged press conference, the CEO appeared smaller somehow, the confident polish of previous appearances dulled by sleepless nights and mounting pressure. He stood at the podium, flanked by advisors who offered no comfort, and delivered the words that just weeks earlier would have seemed unthinkable. In light of recent developments and after consultation with stakeholders, Titan Works will be halting its planned U.S. factory closures. Additionally, we are suspending the expansion of our temporary visa hiring program pending further review. We remain committed to our employees, our communities, and our shared future. No soaring rhetoric, no claims of innovation or progress, just a retreat, plain and public. The news swept across the country faster than the original announcement of closures. Factory towns that had braced for the worst breathed again, cautiously, but with hope they hadn't dared to feel in years. Union halls rang with cheers. Families gathered around televisions and computers, watching the clip over and over, hardly believing what they were hearing. The machine that had seemed unstoppable had, at least for now, been forced to yield. In his office, JD received the news not with celebration, but with quiet reflection. He knew the fight wasn't over. Promises could be reversed. Statements could be softened. But for the first time, the tide had turned. For the first time, power had been made to listen. As his staff worked around him, JD's eye caught on a small envelope that had been left on his desk. A letter, handwritten, addressed in the uneven script of a child. He opened it carefully, unfolding the lined paper inside. The note was simple, but its words carried more weight than any headline. Dear Senator Vance, my dad was going to lose his job at Titan. Now he says he won't. You saved his job. And his pride. Thank you. JDD read it twice. The noise of the city outside fading as the meaning sank in. This was why he fought. Not for the political points, not for the headlines, but for that father, for that child, for the pride that came from work well done in a future restored. He placed the letter gently on his desk, smoothing the creases as if to honor the care that had gone into writing it. Then he straightened, turning his gaze once more to the Capitol beyond his window. The battle wasn't over, but this victory, however fragile, however hard-won, belonged to them all. The news of Titan Works' retreat rippled across the nation, stirring relief in towns that had lived too long in the shadow of economic uncertainty. But for JD, there was no time to dwell on victory. In every congratulatory note, every headline declaring the reversal, he saw the same truth. The structural forces that had driven Titan Works' decisions, and those of so many other companies, remained. A single battle won did not mean the war was over. If anything, it meant the next fight had begun. As the dust settled, JD moved swiftly, unwilling to let momentum slip away. Behind closed doors, he met with colleagues, Republicans, Democrats, independents, lawmakers who, like him, had begun to feel the heat from constituents no longer content with excuses. Some came to the table driven by principle, others by political survival, but JD welcomed all. He knew real change would take more than speeches. It would take action, and action demanded alliances. The meetings were tense at times, with sharp differences on policy and approach. But slowly, steadily, common ground emerged. The need to re-examine trade practices that rewarded offshoring, the urgency of closing immigration loopholes abused at the expense of workers, the imperative to restore dignity to American labor. And so, after weeks of negotiation, the announcement came, not with the bluster of a press spectacle, but with the sober clarity the moment demanded. Standing before the Capitol, JD addressed the nation alongside senators from both sides of the aisle. The cameras rolled, but JD spoke as if addressing the people who had written him, who had filled the galleries at the hearing, who had trusted him to fight when so many others had turned away. Today we launch the American Jobs and Fair Labor Task Force, a bipartisan effort to protect what matters most. Work that sustains families, immigration that strengthens our nation, and policies that honor dignity over dollars. This isn't about left or right, it's about right and wrong. The task force's mandate was clear: investigate corporate practices that encourage offshoring at the expense of U.S. communities, propose reforms to visa systems vulnerable to exploitation, and draft legislation aimed at restoring fairness to an economy that had, for too long, left its workers behind. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't generate viral soundbites. But it was the kind of work that built foundations strong enough to outlast any storm. JD knew the road ahead would be hard. Titan Works and companies like it wouldn't go quietly. Lobbyists would flood the halls of Congress. Campaign coffers would be filled to block meaningful change. The media would continue to spin, to question, to distract. But as he stood beneath the Capitol dome, flanked by unlikely allies, JD felt a resolve deeper than any fear. The fight was bigger than one man, bigger than one hearing. It belonged to the people who had asked him not to stop, not to flinch, not to forget. And so, as the crowd dispersed and the work began, JD allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The father whose job had been saved, the child whose letter now sat framed on his desk, the voices that had once been silent, now rising in unison. This was their fight as much as his, and together they would see it through. The chamber was full, but it wasn't the usual restless crowd of insiders and lobbyists checking their watches. This time, people leaned in. Lawmakers, reporters, citizens who had come from factory towns and farming counties, all of them waiting for what JD would say. The fight that had started with one question had changed the air in this place, and everyone in that room felt it. JD rose, his hands steady on the lectern, his eyes scanning the room not for approval, but for resolve. His voice, when it came, was clear and sure. We've heard enough speeches about growth. We've read enough reports about progress. And for too long, those words have meant one thing to the boardrooms and another to the workers who build this nation. He paused, unrolling a simple chart. No colors, no spin. Just numbers. Jobs lost, wages cut, towns emptied. The quiet in the chamber deepened. Today, I ask this body to choose something different. I ask us to choose fairness over expedience, to choose our people over short-term profit, and I propose the reforms that will help us do that. JD laid them out plainly, without fanfare. Tax penalties for corporations that ship jobs overseas, meaningful incentives for companies that kept and created jobs here at home. Visa rules tightened not to punish, but to protect, to ensure no worker, foreign or domestic, was exploited in the race to the bottom. This isn't about isolation, it's about obligation. To our citizens, to our values, to the promise we made when we said that work in America meant a chance at a better life. He looked out at his colleagues, knowing the battle ahead would be hard. He saw the donors behind the scenes, the lobbyists sharpening their talking points, the ads already drafted to twist his words. But he also saw the faces in the gallery. Workers, families, the ones who had written, called, hoped. And for them, he kept going. We can do better. We must. Because if we don't, the next generation won't just inherit our debt or our deficits, they'll inherit our failures. And I, for one, am not willing to leave them that. When he finished, there was no thunderous applause, no cheers, just a deep, thoughtful quiet. The kind that comes when people hear not what they want, but what they need. Months passed, but the echoes of JD's speech didn't fade. In towns that had nearly given up hope, new conversations began. Companies once planning to close their doors reconsidered, drawn by the new incentives and wary of the penalties. Slowly, change took root. JD visited one of those places on a cold morning in late autumn, a town where Titan Works had once planned a shutdown, where silence had replaced the hum of industry. Now the gates were open again. Machines rumbled to life. The shift bell rang, not as loud as it once had, but with a promise renewed. He walked through the plant, boots echoing on the concrete floor, nodding to the workers who paused at their stations. There were no cameras, no speeches, just JD and the people who knew the cost of the fight. They didn't clap, they didn't cheer. Instead, they offered something more. Quiet nods of respect, firm handshakes, a look that said, "We know what you did." An older worker, gray at the temples, grease on his hands, Stopped JD by a machine. Didn't think we'd see this day, Senator. Figured the last time I walked out those doors would be the last. JD smiled, small and honest. I didn't do it alone. The man nodded. No, but you stood up when it counted. JD stayed until the whistle blew, until the shift ended, and the workers filed out into the crisp air. He watched them go, men and women who, for the first time in too long, walked with their heads a little higher. The Capitol glowed in the evening light as JD returned to his office, the town's images still fresh in his mind. The worn tools picked up again, the shop floors swept clean, the pride that filled the spaces where despair had lingered too long. He set his coat aside, settling at his desk where the hum of the city below seemed distant, almost forgotten. There, among the paperwork and reports, lay the letter. He had read it before, but tonight he unfolded it again, smoothing its creases with care. The handwriting was careful, the words simple. For the first time, we felt seen. JD traced the words with his eyes, letting them remind him why the fight had mattered, why it would always matter. Not for headlines, not for legacy, but for moments like that, for people who no longer felt invisible, for families who could believe again in the promise of their work, their worth. He stood crossing to the shelf where mementos of battles past lined the walls. A small flag from a factory floor, a photo of a town hall crowd, a union pin handed to him by a man who'd worked 40 years before his plant closed. But it was this letter he framed that night, placing it at the center of them all. As he did, he spoke softly, not to the room, not even to himself, but to the spirit of what had carried him this far. That's the America I fight for. And outside, beyond the glass, the city stirred on, unaware of the quiet vow renewed within those walls. But for JD, that promise was enough to face whatever came next. This story reminds us that real change begins when one voice dares to challenge what seems untouchable. JD Vance's journey wasn't just about policy or politics. It was about restoring dignity to work and hope to communities left behind. His stand showed that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a steady, relentless commitment to doing what's right, no matter the cost. The power of one honest question, one sincere act, can ripple across a nation and awaken a shared sense of responsibility. When workers, families, and leaders unite, even the strongest giants can be held accountable. What about you? If you could ask one question that might change your community, what would it be? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.